the resource extraordinarily well. What kind of importance and dependence do they have on it, etc. So that gives you the beginning. Sometimes people have a problem with resource units, but for a person who studied groundwater for a very long time, there you've got water that's pretty stable, and you pull it up and you can measure how much you've pulled up. If you are studying a fishery, your resource units move around and are much more difficult to identify. And if you're studying an irrigation system, which is, again, water, you have things moving downhill, so that looking at the actual units and how they're organized makes a big difference. So to do good research, what you have to do is choose a question carefully. Obviously, one question would be, when will the users of a common pool resource self-organize? And Hardin said never, basically. They were trapped and couldn't. And so many policies of since 1968, when he wrote that published that article on Science, have presumed that that was right, and that governments must impose uniform solutions on all forests, all fisheries, and all water systems. There have been many failures, some successes. That part of our problem is that there's no system like a private or a public or a community that doesn't have a mixture of successes and failures. And what we're needing is to get in and diagnose why there are multiple. But what we want to understand is, when will people identify and self-organize, and why will some of them survive and others collapse? And so research has over time identified a variety of variables that are conducive to self-organization. For those of you who like mathematical models, in the Science article there is a supplement that provides a mathematical foundation for that. But basically, one way of capturing it in very short order is people will self-organize when they perceive the benefits of self-organization to be higher than the costs. Well, that's a very nice thing to do in terms of stating it, but measuring it is entirely different and difficult problem. And so in the earlier thing, I'd starred a number of variables as affecting the probability of self-organization. I'm going to turn to two different cases to illustrate this. So the first one will be a series of fishing communities along the coast of Mexico, with good field work. Javier Basurto, who is my co-author here, was able to really get good data on the fisheries, what kind of benefits and what were the costs that local fishermen were paying. And there are 3 fishing villages along the coast of that's the Gulf of California. I was born in Los Angeles, a little bit further above the border between Mexico and the United States. The area way high, which had a group of fishermen that were very, very important. Penasco. For a lot of the fishermen came in low into the system and would not get up there. And they were able to develop a system. But we studied that and the system of Kino and the others. So, deep end shells. And these are very difficult. When you go fishing for them, you see a shell like in the upper right-hand corner. you don't see the mollusk. And the size of the mollusk and the size of the shell are not perfectly correlated. So a very knowledgeable fisherman gains a real skill in trying to determine where slow and medium size. There is local leadership in Seri and Penasco, but not in Kino. Trust and reciprocity is lacking in Kino, present in Penasco and Seri. Shared local knowledge is lacking in Kino, but exists in high levels in Penasco and Seri. Dependence on the resource is low, high, high. Technology, they all use the same, so there's no real difference in the technology of use. The governance system, both Kino and Penasco did not have formal property system. Seri, as an indigenous community, had the government of Mexico assign a formal system to them. That meant that they had formal rights. Operational rules were present in almost all three at a pretty effective level. Were there in all three. But the monitoring and sanctioning of what was going on was absent in Kino and present in Seri and Penasco. The resource system was large versus small and small. The accuracy of the indicators and the availability of them was not very available under Kino, and moderately or mostly available with Penasco and Seri. And basically, you could finish the rest of the table. Two of the SCSs were organized, and I think as you look at that table, it's very obvious, if you'll flip back one, that Penasco and Seri were similar on most fronts. So just run down that series. It's not perfectly similar, but the table gives us, the SES framework gives us a way of identifying important similarities. But Kino was entirely different. It was a very much larger system. It turned out it was a large commercial center, a very large number of people out fishing. They did not get to know one another very well. The productivity, the indicators of that system were less in Kino. The predictability was less. Local leadership was absent. Trust and reciprocity were absent. So people want to find a single variable. This is the variable. Well, that's rare that you ever find a single variable. Kino Bay was open access, and that's an incredible lineup of boats waiting to go out at any time. They had no rules about who could go out, when, where, and how. So it was really a overfished, open access fishery. Seri, on the other hand, was they developed their own common property regime, so that they developed a decision about who could fish at what time and how many mollusks they could capture. So what we have is, looking at this, is that two of the SCSs had a chance of having self-organized, of being robust over time. But is self-organization sufficient? And the answer has to be, unfortunately, no. The reserve that was set up in Penasco was so successful. That was the one way high on the coast, that other fishermen who had never been up there started coming up and fishing. And so the fishery they had protected from their own overuse But they tried then to get the government and others to help them keep others out. And the government said, no, you have your own property rights, but you can't keep others out. So having attracted fishers from a wide variety of sources, they were overfished by others, and they finally said, heck, why should we be so conservative? Let's go in and fish ourselves and forget it, because they're going to ruin our fishery. So they did. Okay, so that gets us at robustness, and that was, Sherrod mentioned governing the commons. In that book, I dealt with a variety of design principles, including boundaries between of those who are actors and the resource be clear, the congruence between benefits and costs. Actors had procedures for making their own rules, regular monitoring of actors and resource conditions, graduated sanctions, conflict resolutions, minimal recognition of rights by government, and nested or polycentric system. And it is obvious that Kino had very few of those. The Seri fishery had almost all, and Penasco had procedures for making their own rules, but they didn't have the bottom design principles. They weren't recognized. So they could make rules, but that wasn't sufficient. Now, I'd like to move across the Atlantic to a country that you know and a community that you know. Moving here to Bangalore, I've been working with Harini Najendra in using the SES framework to understand why there are differences among the lakes in Bangalore. As many of you know, in earlier times, farmers built those lakes as ponds for farming. And they had developed their rules so that in 2,000 years ago, 1,500, 1,000 years ago, they were well governed. But then you had the Brits come in, and then they decided, developed a system which was adopted by a variety of others. And so they lost that. For those of you who have not looked at the lake system, it's really incredible. The number of lakes and their interties, if you were to then go and visit, if you go to, now I'm afraid, Harini, can you say the name? Okay. Was a very polluted lake until recently, but now it's been restored through collaboration. Then if you go to Vartar, one of the larger lakes at the end of the lake chain, but now heavily polluted with sewage as well as toxic hospital effluents. So when you have industrial waste and hospital waste, that is a very big problem. So then let's go ahead and share the analysis that Harini and I have done. And this is not final. We have a paper in almost final draft. But if anybody has any suggestions for us, we will be very appreciative. Oh, you may have a hard time seeing that. Sorry. We have the 7 lakes across the top. And the variables from the table across down the size. Basically, if anybody wants to see a copy of that recent paper, we would be very happy to share it. What we have is that for dependent variables, we looked at had they really engaged in collective action. So our first question was collective action, do they do it? And 2, did they then help reduce the pollution in the lake? And 2 lakes were successful in both of those outcome variables. One was rather small and one moderate, but they shared similar rankings on all other variables. So that they have been able to cope with pollution levels. They were the only two to achieve high ecological performance ratings. They've learned how to network with government officials in such a way that they've been able to get very substantial help and develop a real effective system. On the other hand, one of the interesting things about your metropolitan area is that it takes a very substantial amount of organization on the part of local communities to get organized. And the level of pollution across lakes for the ones that are not successful yet is very substantial. So for people who have to use groundwater, it can be a very, very substantial problem. Many of you will have observed protest movements, maybe wondered a bit about them. But if you live next to a lake that gets worse and worse and you can't get anyone active in doing something about it, you move to protest. And so in some respects, you have a system that has allowed a fair amount of initiative on the part of some of the lakes. But it has not allowed a lot. And part of it is that you have very large lakes that have a very, very substantial problem of who in the government do they deal with, since there are so many government agencies involved. The responsibility for developing local rules, practices, has been organized by some neighborhood organizations, but they don't have, it's pretty hard if you're a neighborhood organization to deal with industry or hospitals or jails. That are very substantial sources of pollution. And as I've talked about polycentricity, which is having large, medium, and small systems, it's not a panacea, but without it, there are some problems that you just cannot solve. And so I am hoping that our paper, when it is final, helps people move toward a more polycentric system for this important area that I'm very pleased that we were able to study. So let me turn to questions if there are any, I'm very glad to answer for a few minutes because I think time is limited, but if there are questions. Thank you.
We normally don't have questions in these lectures, but I think we still have 3 more minutes. If there are any questions, I'm sure there are.
Well, it might be that you don't ask tonight, but Harini, I think you're willing to take them over the next several weeks if some comes along. The Mexico case, you have a more thorough description of. Yeah, yes. At the back.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to have you with us, listen to you. Can I ask you a question unrelated to your lecture presentation, but on the sustainability issue? It seems to some of us that it's a question of lifestyles at heart. And the problem is what Schumacher called the first-class passengers on spaceship Earth. What would you say as regards the sustainability of the lifestyle in the developed world as a whole? We don't see, even after the economic crisis, a fundamental questioning of the sustainability of that lifestyle. All the effort seems to be to get back to business as usual. So a first-rate opportunity seems to have been lost. And I just like
you have the voice to raise that question.
No, everybody has the voice. That's a different thing. But what would you say about the sustainability?
Well, I think we're running very severe risks. But I don't see it as, at the point that Hardin's work was believed as the truth, then people would raise the questions of, let's get organized, let's get in there and do something. People would say, oh, that's foolish. At this point, I think we have evidence over 20, 30 years from a variety of places that it's difficult, but not impossible. And so hopefully when we are teaching and work with our students, they learn about success cases in difficult. The fishery case is a difficult one in Mexico, but the success of the Penasco fishermen was rather amazing, and they are able to sustain it. What's tragic is that an indigenous group like the Seri have been told that they are able to make rules about internal life, but they can't exclude anybody else from using their fishery. So what we need is to have very strong sense that it can be done, but it needs government help from the perspective that in many instances governments have said, no, you may not, as the government of Mexico did to the Seri. No, you cannot enforce your own rules. And we've got to articulate with our government officials that there are polycentric systems that involve much higher levels of the green economy over the long run, and that we're not going to be able to have a decent globe if we don't open that up. So there's work for us all. Well, I think we'll take questions later because I think I've run out of time.
Dr. Seema Purushothaman, Fellow ATREE, will propose the vote of thanks.
Friends, since 1901, since the inception of Nobel Prize awards, around 830 individuals across the globe have won Nobel Prize. Of that, just 43 are women. And if you go into the data of the prize in economic sciences, there have been 69 individuals winning the award, and there is only one woman winning it. So we have one of those very rare women on earth with us today. And my peers of the same gender in the academic world would know how a not so easy task it is to thrive and get recognized in the academic world. I have listened to her public talks 3 times before. One was on the resilience of socio-ecological systems. The second was on rural commons. The third one was on environment and development issues. And this time, we were refreshingly enlightened on the self-organization, polycentricity, and the multiple role of public protests and the ways to seek power balance to conserve social ecological systems. So I would like to express on behalf of first all the women gathered here, then on behalf of ATREE, Khoshoo family, IRAD Delhi, and on behalf of all the audience here, my sincere appreciation and gratitude for the very inspirational presence and thoughtful lecture to Madam Elinor Ostrom. I thank the awardees for their valuable presence, Hemlata Pradhan and Sandeep Tambe. I also express our sincere gratitude to the Khoshoo family, IRAD Delhi, and all the audience who have gathered here in making this 8th edition of Khoshoo Memorial Awards and Lecture a grand success. Most importantly, National Institute of Advanced Studies for letting us use the premises, ATREE volunteers who did a tremendous job with organizing the whole show, our dear and most efficient person at ATREE, Mr. Ramesh, Hemalata, and Meetu, and Ramesh from NIAS, and again, all of us who have gathered here to make this wonderful evening a fact. I conclude. Thank you, each one.